Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we recreate famous figures from the past and talk about their history. Today, we'll be talking about Vincent van Gogh, the quintessential tortured artist. His life was filled with many self-inflicted hardships that would take him down a somber path, but ultimately lead him to his passion for painting. We'll talk about his troubled life, what he really looked like, and then reveal Becca's recreations at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30th, 1853 in Zundert, Netherlands. His mother Anna was from a prosperous family, and his father Theodorus was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. Although Theodorus' salary was pretty modest, the church provided him with more than he could ever need, including the house they lived in, maids, cooks, gardeners, and even a horse and carriage. From a very early age, Vincent's mother would instill in him the incredible importance of family, but also drilled into him the importance of keeping their family's high social status. He would end up the eldest child out of 6, with his sister Anna coming next, then Theo, Elizabeth, Wilhelmina, and Cor. He would be schooled at home by his mother and their governess for many years. But in 1864, when Van Gogh was 11 years old, he was sent off to boarding school in Segovia, away from his family for the first time. Van Gogh was inconsolably upset. He would beg his mother to let him come home, to the family that she had assured him should be his main priority in his life, but he was denied. His education was too important. Their social status was too important. Homesick from the start, Vincent would spend the next 2 years at boarding school and then be transferred to a middle school in Tilburg, 40 miles away. It was actually here where he received his first painting lessons. And although he had loved drawing when he was younger, there's no evidence that Vincent showed any interest in these lessons at all. He hated being away from home, and it was no secret to anyone that he was incredibly unhappy. Any free time he had was spent alone, on long walks through the countryside of Tilburg, which he would later describe as some of the most beautiful landscape he ever saw. This period away from home really affected Van Gogh. He'd become familiar with the sadness that he would suffer bouts with for the rest of his life. But it would be that same sadness that would inspire the style and subjects of some of his most famous works. In 1868, after 2 miserable years in middle school, his father finally took the hint, and he was brought back home. Vincent would later describe his youth as cold and sterile. Luckily for Vincent, it wouldn't be long before his life finally began to look up. His uncle Cent was a successful art dealer and got his nephew a job at a major auction house. After finishing his training in 1873, Van Gogh moved to London and began his work at a prestigious auction house. Over the last few years, Van Gogh had developed his taste in art and had become obsessed with seeing as much of it as he possibly could. He would go to Paris to the Louvre and to Amsterdam to visit every museum he could find. It wasn't long before he learned to love paintings by Jean-François Millet and Julie Breton, who were part of the realism movement. Many of their paintings would show the lives of the peasant class with no filter. Something about their paintings seemed to strike a chord with Van Gogh, and he decided that he would someday find a way to help them, somehow, some way. When he could finally afford a room of his own in London, his younger sister Anna moved in with him in order to find a job. In letters to Theo, he writes about how much he loved to walk with Anna through the city at night, falling in love with London again, and how much he adored the time they spent together. Van Gogh was the happiest he had ever been, and the people around him would later say that 1874 was the happiest year of his life. With everything going right for him, Van Gogh fell in love with his landlady's daughter, Eugenie Lawyer. In August of 1874, he would confess his love to Eugenie, hoping to make her his wife. Unfortunately for Van Gogh, she was already secretly engaged to another man, and she outright rejected him. Vincent was beyond crushed by this, and it sparked in him that familiar feeling of sadness that had plagued his years at school. This one event would set in motion years of what can really only be described as chaotic self-sabotage by Vincent. He began to isolate himself from everyone, including his sister. Anna's company, which used to be so sweet to Vincent, became a nuisance. By December, she would write to Theo that Vincent had become strange and unfriendly. he was also irritable and hard to live with. He even began to despise his job, and although his appreciation for art remained, his disgust at the trade of art grew. All of these incredible masterpieces of art were being sold to the highest bidder. It made him sick. In an attempt to help Vincent snap out of it, his father and uncle arranged a transfer from the London office to Paris. But the move only made Van Gogh even more reclusive. He began to read the Bible alone in his room, and in letters to his brother, Vincent began to quote scripture more and more often. In 1876, he was fired from the auction house. He would bounce around from job to job for nearly a year, before he realized that his true calling in life was to become a priest. But school was never Van Gogh's strong suit, and he would fail his exam to enter the University of Amsterdam. So instead, he found a post as a missionary in a very poor coal mining town in Belgium. But during the winter of 1879, Van Gogh was struggling with his faith. Why should he live so comfortably while the people around him suffer? He would begin to give most of his possessions to the people of the village, resorting to living in a small hut. Only weeks into his posting, the church began to disagree with his personal brand of Christianity. He was taking God's words too literally, they would say, and his poor living conditions were undermining the dignity of the priesthood. But Van Gogh refused to listen and was let go soon after. It seemed that no matter what Van Gogh did, no matter how passionate he was or how good his intentions were, he was doomed to fail at whatever he set his mind to. With no money, no belongings, and his faith shattered, Van Gogh would manically decide to walk 50 miles alone to Brussels before telling anyone what had even happened. At 27, Van Gogh fell deeper into depression than ever before. For a full year, Van Gogh did nothing, finding no interest in living, much less finding work. He moved back in with his parents, but they were increasingly disappointed with him. When Vincent's father threatened to send him to a lunatic asylum, he moved out and found a place to stay in a small village in Belgium. With nothing to distract his troubled mind, Van Gogh began to draw. Looking out from the window of his small rented room, he saw the unfiltered lives of the peasant class and remembered what he had told himself so many years ago. Somehow, some way, he would find a way to help them. If he couldn't do it through faith, he would do it through art. At the suggestion of his brother Theo, Vincent would go to an art academy to study seriously. Theo had always had a kind and unwavering faith in his brother. Now a successful art dealer himself, he would begin to financially support Van Gogh in order to allow him to commit to art full-time. He'd continue to do so for the rest of Van Gogh's life. Never a lover of formal education, Van Gogh's time at the academy was short-lived, and he instead decided that he would learn how to paint from other artists. In late 1881, he was introduced to oil painting and watercolor by the realist painter Anton Malfe. Van Gogh greatly admired Malfe's work with color and nature, but within months of meeting, they had a falling out and never spoke again. Van Gogh's friendships always seemed to end quickly and badly, in anger or hate, but I think Van Gogh's real emotion comes out through his paintings. When Anton died suddenly a few years later, Van Gogh painted this beautiful memorial to him. In 1883, Van Gogh moved to Nune. During the 2 years he lived there, he would develop a work ethic that would allow him to produce more than 200 oil paintings, along with countless sketches and drawings. Every day, he would go out and paint something. But some of his subjects became recurring favorites of his, like this old church. Its spire can be seen in the background of multiple paintings throughout his years in Hainaut. What's interesting about the old church is that its spire was never actually there. Its real roof had been torn down almost a century before. But Van Gogh saw his paintings as a tribute to when the church had been a beacon of hope to centuries of people who had lived in the village. And I think as a tribute to when religion was a beacon of hope for himself. Although his faith had been destroyed, he was beginning to find it again. But when his father died suddenly in March of 1885, his grief was overwhelming. And when he decided to paint the church again, it was no longer the beacon of hope he had painted before. But only a few months later, Theo had secured a spot for Van Gogh at the auction house. It would be Van Gogh's first chance to show the world his work. He would send Theo this piece. Vincent saw this painting as the culmination of years of work and would later call it his greatest painting. But initial reception to it was very cold. Even Theo, Vincent's greatest fan, would eventually tell him that his paintings are just too dark and too monotonous to sell. If he wanted to be successful, he would have to learn how to use color. Although initially hurt, he knew that Theo was right. For 3 months straight, Van Gogh would obsess over color theory. His style begins to shift from dark, muted tones to more vibrant colors for the first time. But it isn't until Theo asks him to move to Paris in the spring of 1886 that Van Gogh really begins to excel. He would first get comfortable with blue in the spring. Then the summer was red, and even at this point you can see how much his work has improved. But by the end of 1886, his art is almost unrecognizable. Color has transformed Van Gogh's art. And soon, he begins to catch the eye of other Parisian artists. He would meet artists like Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who would paint this portrait of him. And also Paul Signac, whose pointillism style depended on tiny dots of complementing color to make an illusion of color in his paintings, an idea that would greatly influence Van Gogh's later paintings. In just over a year, Van Gogh improved immensely. The easiest way I can show you just how much of a jump he made is to compare his own self-portraits in the spring of 1886 when he arrived in Paris to this one, made in the spring of 1887. Van Gogh's hard work with color shines in this portrait, but you can also see obvious changes to his technique, with shades of pointillism and unique brushstrokes coming through as well. Van Gogh would take these new techniques and paint over 200 pieces over the next 2 years, trying out different styles and honing in on his own. But by 1888, Van Gogh's physical health had begun to deteriorate. His obsession with painting these last few years left him with little money for necessities. Malnutrition, paired with years of excessive drinking and smoking, had left Van Gogh with missing teeth and a horrible cough. In an attempt to nurse himself back to health, he'd move away from his hectic Parisian life to a coastal city in the south of France. When he arrived, he rented out a large house that would later be known as the Yellow House. The Yellow House would become one of Van Gogh's most prolific painting periods, and by the summer of 1888, he began to decorate the walls of the Yellow House with the pieces that had been inspired by his time in Arles. Many of these pieces have gone on to become iconic, selling for millions of dollars each. Van Gogh was finally emerging as the artist he had always wanted to be. And soon, an idea would come to him to turn Arles and the Yellow House into an art colony, where artists would come from all over Europe to learn, collaborate, and inspire each other. But in October of 1888, a series of events would lead to one of the most bizarre moments in art history. Paul Gauguin, an established and well-respected artist, agreed to come and live with Van Gogh after months of his pleading. Van Gogh knew that he alone could not make the art colony into a reality, and in his eyes, he saw Gauguin as the key to his vision's success. If he chose to come, many would follow. But in reality, Van Gogh's brother Theo was paying Gauguin to go and visit Vincent. You see, Theo was Gauguin's art dealer and had promised him 150 francs for every month he stayed at the Yellow House. Gauguin had always seen the trip as nothing but a way for him to save enough money for him to travel again, and he never had any real intention of staying. Nevertheless, during his stay, he would teach Van Gogh how to paint from his memory instead of sketches, and Van Gogh would create this painting of his mother, called Memory of the Garden at Eden. But it wasn't long before Gauguin's true intentions began to show. Van Gogh cared so much, not only about earning Gauguin's respect, but also making him believe in the idea of an art colony. They began to fight almost daily, and on December 23, 1888, it all boiled over. In the days leading up to the event, rain had kept the two painters stuck inside the Yellow House with nothing to do. The tension between them had only grown, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before something happened. When the fight finally did happen, something in Van Gogh snapped, and according to Gauguin, Van Gogh threatened him with a razor. It's thought that Gauguin might have finally told Van Gogh his real plan, that his stay in Arles was just a way for him to make money to leave Europe again, ruining Van Gogh's vision of the art collective he had put all his hopes into, and marking yet another failure to Van Gogh's miserable career. After Gauguin stormed out, Van Gogh would suffer from a mental breakdown. He began to hear voices, and in his enraged manic state, he sliced off his left ear. He then wrapped the severed ear in wax paper and delivered it to a prostitute that Gauguin frequented. Vincent was found unconscious the next morning and taken to a hospital. When he woke up, he claimed to have no recollection of the event. He'd remain in and out of the hospital until May of 1889, when he was admitted to the St. Paul Asylum. At the asylum, Van Gogh would be hit with attacks of what is now thought to have been epilepsy, and his depressive swings worsened. In an attempt to help, the doctors allowed him to paint the garden and its flowers, a field with its trees, and even his own portrait, hiding his missing ear. But one night, while he was looking out of his window, he began one of his most iconic paintings, The Starry Night. Some art historians believe this dream-like painting may have been inspired by Van Gogh's own hallucinations, while others outright deny the theory as a possibility. Either way, this painting, along with others completed during his time at the asylum, are the culmination of years of work and show Van Gogh at the peak of his abilities. In May of 1890, after a full year, Van Gogh finally left the asylum. Van Gogh would move to a small town 15 miles outside of Paris, called Segovia. A couple of weeks after arriving, he would write to his family that he could feel that he was starting to get better and that he was painting a lot. When he heard news of Theo and his wife having a son, he felt a small relief of happiness for the first time in a long time. He would paint his brother this painting for him to hang in the baby's room. But these moments of happiness would prove too far and few between. When he sat down to paint wheat field with crows, he later wrote to his brother Theo that he made a point of expressing sadness and extreme loneliness in the painting. It was the last painting he ever finished. On July 27th, 1890, Van Gogh shot himself in the chest. He would die 2 days later, with his brother Theo by his side. Although Van Gogh lost his struggle against his mental health, his life mission to inspire and bring joy to as many people as possible has been fully realized. I'm sure it would bring him immeasurable happiness to know just how much his work means to people, and to know that he was right in the fact that his true calling was to paint. His ability to show emotion through his art, pain, sadness, loneliness, happiness, joy, will forever immortalize him in the one thing he truly loved: art. If you are ever in a dark place and need someone to talk to, please do not hesitate to call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988. You are worth it. I promise you.
So let's go ahead and talk about what Vincent van Gogh may have looked like in real life, which is actually harder to pin down than we might think. According to the Van Gogh Museum, Van Gogh painted his self-portraits not particularly for self-expression or studying his own appearance. He painted them simply because he wanted to experiment with the human form, and models were often very expensive. There are 35 self-portraits of Vincent, and only one photo portrait of him. Each self-portrait is a really interesting window into his mental condition. In one, we even see him with the bandage on his left ear. In another, we see dark, dramatic colors and angles reminiscent of his mental anguish at the time. Of course, it's notable that Van Gogh looks different in each portrait. Although his general facial features are there each time, we've got red hair, defined cheekbones, and a slightly hooked nose, the details change with each version. Sometimes his features are subtle, other times really exaggerated. Van Gogh's image was also painted by other artists, and I think these capture a really beautiful, less stylized version of Vincent. I've used this self-portrait for my recreation. After looking through them all, this one somehow seems to fall perfectly in the middle. It's also comparable to his photo portrait as a young man, kind of looking like a thin, aged-up version of that image. I've also created a version of what Van Gogh might look like today, just for fun. So let's check out some recreations of the amazing artist now.